The perfume was the first thing I noticed, before I noticed anything else was wrong. Sweet, unfamiliar, tangled into the scent she usually wore, like someone else had stood close enough to leave a trace of themselves on her collar. My name is Jeffrey. I'm married to Natalie, have been for 8 years now, and until that Friday night in late autumn, I would have told you, without hesitation, that ours was a good marriage, not perfect, nobody's is, but solid in the way that lets you stop paying attention to the foundation because you trust it's still there. We lived in a 2-bedroom apartment on Winslow Street that we'd made into something that actually felt like ours, and most nights we still ate dinner together at the same small table, still talked about our days the way people do when they haven't yet learned to stop asking. That Friday, Natalie had gotten ready to go out with a fresh kind of energy I hadn't seen from her in a while, not just dressed up, but lit up, the way she used to look years earlier when we were still new to each other. She said Courtney had convinced her to try a new club downtown, something to shake off a long week. I told her to have fun. I meant it. 8 years in, I still trusted her completely, not as a daily decision, but as ground I stood on without thinking about it. She came home a little after 1 in the morning. I was still awake, half watching something on my laptop in bed, and when she came through the bedroom door, I noticed it immediately, the perfume, foreign and sweet, riding just underneath her own. I almost said something. Instead I asked how her night was. Good, she said, already turned toward the closet, already unzipping her dress with her back to me. Loud. My ears are still ringing. You smell different, I said, trying to keep my voice light, curious rather than accusing. Everyone was smoking those weird flavored things near the bar, she said, not turning around. It gets into everything. I let it go. I want to be honest that this was the first of many times I let something go that Friday and in the months after it, not because I was stupid, but because the alternative, questioning her directly, felt like an accusation I didn't yet have the right to make. 8 years of trust doesn't dissolve over one strange smell. That's what I told myself, lying there in the dark, listening to her breathing even out into sleep faster than usual. I didn't sleep as easily. I kept turning the smell over in my mind, trying to place it, trying to convince myself it belonged to a stranger who'd brushed past her on a crowded dance floor and nothing more. In the morning, she was quieter than usual over coffee, scrolling her phone with a kind of focus that seemed slightly too intense for a Saturday. I asked if she'd had a good time. It was fine, she said. Courtney got really into it. I mostly just watched her. A small, unnecessary detail, offered before I'd asked for one, the kind of extra color people add when they're building a story they want to sound complete. I didn't know that yet. I just filed it away. Over the following weeks, small things began to accumulate, nothing dramatic on its own, just texture, the kind of static you only notice once you've started listening for it. Natalie began keeping her phone face down, something she'd never bothered with before. When it buzzed, her hand moved toward it a half-second faster than it used to, an instinct she hadn't had a month earlier. She mentioned Courtney's name more often, always attached to plans that seemed to multiply, coffee here, girls' night there, and whenever I asked a simple follow-up question, she'd answer quickly and pivot the conversation somewhere else, the way you skip past a bruise when someone reaches toward it. I want to say clearly, before this story goes any further, that none of it felt sinister in the moment. It felt like an ordinary autumn. It felt like the normal friction of two people who'd been together long enough to stop examining every gesture. That's what makes it dangerous in hindsight, not that the signs were hidden, but that they were dressed exactly like nothing at all. I didn't know it yet, but that unfamiliar perfume wasn't the strangest thing I'd notice about her that season. It wasn't even close. The weeks after that first club night settled into something that looked, from a distance, exactly like our marriage always had. We still cooked together most evenings. We still fell asleep to the same shows, still argued about the thermostat the way we'd argued about it for 8 years. If you'd asked me in early November whether something was wrong, I think I would have hesitated, not because everything was fine, but because nothing was undeniably broken. It was smaller than that. Quieter. Natalie started going out more regularly, not every week, but often enough that it had shifted from an occasional thing to something closer to a pattern. Always with Courtney, always at clubs I'd never heard of before that season, always coming home late enough that I'd usually already be in bed. I noticed the perfume again, twice more, in the 2 weeks that followed, not every time, which somehow made it worse, because it meant I couldn't dismiss it as one strange, explainable night. I want to stop here for a second. If you've ever caught yourself quietly building a case against someone you love, gathering evidence in the back of your mind while your mouth kept insisting everything was fine, you already know how exhausting that particular kind of silence becomes. It isn't peace. It just resembles peace, from far enough away. Sydney, a friend of ours from Natalie's old job, came over one evening to return a jacket Natalie had left at her place months earlier. While Natalie was in the other room, Sydney asked me, almost too carefully, how things had been going between us. Good, I said. Busy, but good. Sydney nodded slowly, and then said something I didn't understand the weight of until much later, just, keep your eyes open, Jeffrey. That's all I'll say. I asked what she meant. She said, forget it, it's not my place, and changed the subject so abruptly it left a kind of static hanging in the room, the unmistakable feeling that she'd almost said something and stopped herself. I brought it up to Natalie that night, gently, asking if something had happened between her and Sydney. Her answer came too fast, already prepared. Sydney's always been a little dramatic. Don't read into it. I wanted to believe her. Wanting to believe someone and actually believing them, I was starting to learn, are not the same thing, even though for years I'd never had a reason to notice the difference. The club nights continued, though the excuses shifted depending on the day, unwinding from work, Courtney's going through something and needs company, reasons that always sounded reasonable in isolation and increasingly hollow stacked together. One Thursday she left in a dress I didn't recognize, deep green, and when I told her she looked beautiful, something crossed her face too fast for me to name, not quite pleasure, something closer to guilt wearing pleasure's expression. That was the night I first heard the name Derek, though not from her. I'd driven near the part of downtown where she'd said she'd be, telling myself I just wanted takeout from a place nearby, and I recognized her laugh drifting out through the open door of a bar before I ever saw her, a laugh I knew the exact shape of, but hadn't heard aimed at anyone but me in longer than I wanted to admit. She was seated at a corner booth with people I didn't recognize, and a man beside her, leaning in close, his arm draped along the back of the booth in a way that wasn't quite touching her shoulder and wasn't quite not. I didn't go inside. I stood outside for maybe a minute, long enough to hear the bartender pass by their table and say, same as always for you and Derek, and watch Natalie nod without correcting him, without adding and my husband's probably wondering where I am, without any of the small tells that might have meant this was nothing at all. I want to be honest that I didn't confront her that night either. I drove home, and when she came in past midnight, I asked how her evening had gone, and she said, fine, same as usual, and I said nothing about the bar, or the name, or the arm along the back of the booth. I told myself I needed more than a glimpse through a doorway before saying something I couldn't take back. The truth, looking back, is that I was still hoping, actively, desperately hoping, that if I waited long enough, she'd tell me herself, and I wouldn't have to be the one to break whatever fragile thing was still holding us together. She didn't tell me. Not that week, not the next. A few days later, doing laundry, I found a receipt balled up in her jacket pocket, a bar tab split between two names, only one of which was hers, dated the same night as the corner booth and the laugh I'd recognized through an open door. I didn't say anything about that either. I was starting to build something without fully realizing it, a private ledger of small proofs I wasn't ready to present out loud, as if collecting them quietly could somehow soften whatever conversation was waiting at the end of it. I didn't know it yet, but that receipt was only the first of many things I'd end up keeping folded away in the same drawer, each one small enough to explain on its own, all of them together telling a story I still wasn't letting myself read. By December, the smallest interactions between us had taken on a strange, careful quality, like two people navigating a room they both knew had a trap in it somewhere, neither one willing to say where. Natalie had grown distant in ways that were hard to point to directly. She'd stopped asking about my day with any real curiosity, started answering my questions about hers with clipped, single-word responses that closed a conversation rather than opening one. I called Courtney one evening, hoping, foolishly, I can see now, that she might tell me something honest if I asked directly enough. "Is Natalie seeing someone?" I asked, my voice steadier than I actually felt. There was a pause on the line long enough that the pause itself became an answer. "Jeffrey, that's really not something I can get into," Courtney said finally. "You should be talking to Natalie about this, not me." "That's not a no," I said. "It's not a yes either," she said, and I could hear something strained underneath her voice, like she was holding a door shut with her whole body. "Please. Just talk to her." I hung up feeling worse than before I'd called, not because I'd learned anything concrete, but because Courtney's refusal to say no had told me more than any direct answer could have. Some silences are louder than words. That was one of them. The following week, I ran into Sydney at the grocery store, and something in her had shifted since our last conversation. She looked at me with an expression I could only describe as pity, quickly masked, before she said hello. I asked her, carefully, if she'd heard anything about Natalie and someone named Derek. Her face did something complicated. "I really shouldn't say anything," she said. "It's not my place." "But, Jeffrey, pay attention to what's actually in front of you. Not what you're hoping is in front of you." I want to stop here for a second. If you've ever had someone almost tell you a truth and then pull back at the last moment, leaving you to sit with the shape of what they didn't say, you know exactly the kind of quiet that follows. It's worse, somehow, than silence from someone who genuinely knows nothing at all. That was the moment, looking back now, when I truly started to doubt, not the vague unease of that first Friday, but something colder and more specific. I'd called it paranoia for 2 months. I wouldn't call it that anymore. This is what Natalie told me, much later, about a night she spent with Derek that same week, a scene I had no access to as it was happening. I told myself, sitting across from him that night, that this was the last time I'd let myself feel this reckless. I kept thinking about Jeffrey at home, probably half asleep in front of the television, having no idea, and it should have been enough to make me leave. Instead it made me feel invisible in a way I hated admitting to myself, like the version of me that existed on Winslow Street had stopped mattering to either of us while we sat there. I told myself 5 months wasn't that long in the grand scheme of 8 years, that it would end on its own eventually, that I'd stop before it became something neither of us could undo. I didn't believe myself, even as I said it in my head. That's what she told me. At the time, I only knew that something in her had gone somewhere I couldn't follow, and that every excuse she offered afterward had begun sounding rehearsed in a way it never had before. I started noticing behavioral things I'd have dismissed months earlier, the way she'd angle her phone screen away even while texting her mother, the way she'd started taking calls from the bathroom with the fan running, the way she flinched, almost imperceptibly, whenever I mentioned the word club in any context at all. Each one alone meant nothing. Together, they'd started forming a shape I couldn't unsee. I mentioned to her, one evening, that I'd heard the name Derek somewhere, and asked, as neutrally as I could manage, who he was. That was the first time she snapped at me, not loudly, but with a coldness I hadn't heard from her before. "Derek's nobody," she said, already turning away, already ending the conversation before it had properly begun. "Why are you even asking?" I didn't have a good answer for her in that moment, though I've had months since to think of several. What I remember most isn't what she said, but how fast she said it, the speed of a denial that had clearly been sitting ready in her mouth for weeks, waiting for exactly this question to arrive. I didn't know it yet, but "he's nobody" was going to become the phrase I replayed more than any other, long after I learned exactly how much he'd actually mattered. I want to tell you I approached what came next with a clear head. The truth is closer to the opposite. I spent the better part of 2 weeks oscillating between wanting concrete proof and being terrified of what finding it would actually cost me. Sydney called me herself, near the middle of December, her voice different from any version of her I'd heard before, smaller, tired, like she'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and had finally decided to set it down. "I have something you need to see," she said. "I've gone back and forth about showing you for weeks. I think not showing you would make me part of it, and I don't want to be part of it anymore. We met at a coffee shop 2 days later. She slid her phone across the table without much preamble, a photograph, taken from across a street, of Natalie and a man I now knew to be Derek, his hand resting at the small of her back as they walked toward a building I didn't recognize, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. Sydney had taken it herself, she told me, weeks earlier, before she'd worked up the courage to decide what to do with it. I've known for a while, Sydney admitted, not quite meeting my eyes. Courtney's known longer. I think she's been covering for her, honestly, running interference whenever it looked like you were getting close. I should have told you sooner. I kept telling myself it wasn't my place, and then I kept telling myself that every week, until it started feeling less like respect for your marriage and more like cowardice. I sat with the photograph in front of me for a long moment, feeling something in my chest go very still and very cold, not the shock I might have expected, but something closer to confirmation. Not everything I'd suspected over those weeks turned out to be accurate. There was a name that had briefly worried me earlier in the fall, a coworker of Natalie's I'd grown convinced was involved, who turned out to be nothing more than a colleague helping with an unrelated project. I mention that because it matters. I let my fear write conclusions the evidence hadn't actually earned, more than once, and I owe myself the honesty of admitting that. But Derek was real. And once Sydney's photograph confirmed it, the rest of the pieces I'd been quietly collecting for months, the perfume, the receipt, the bartender's easy familiarity, the deleted messages I'd glimpsed but never opened, arranged themselves into a picture I could no longer talk myself out of seeing. I went back to the bar myself that weekend and spoke to the bartender directly, the same one, I realized, who'd asked about Derek months earlier without knowing I was listening from the doorway. He recognized Natalie's name immediately, and after a moment's hesitation, confirmed what I already knew. Yeah, man, she's in here a lot with that guy. I figured they were together, honestly, the way they act. I didn't know she was married. I sat in my car outside that bar for a long time afterward, Sydney's photograph saved on my phone, and I thought about every single time over the past 5 months that Natalie had told me I was imagining things, that Derek was nobody, that I needed to trust her more. I thought about how many of those moments I'd chosen to believe her, not because the evidence supported it, but because believing her had always been easier than the alternative. I called Sydney one more time that night, mostly just to hear a voice that had been honest with me from the start. You have what you need now, she said gently. The hard part isn't knowing anymore. It's deciding what you're going to do with it. I didn't know it yet, but the conversation I was bracing myself for, careful, evidence laid out, controlled, wasn't anything close to the one Natalie and I were actually about to have. I waited until Sunday morning, the photograph pulled up on my phone, sitting on the kitchen table between us like something neither of us wanted to acknowledge directly. We need to talk, I said, and even as the words left my mouth, I noticed the strange weight of them, a phrase we'd used 100 times over 8 years for small, ordinary things, now carrying something entirely different. About what? Natalie said, arms already crossing over her chest, her voice already sharpening into the defensive register I'd started to recognize over the past few weeks. I turned my phone around and showed her the photograph. She looked at it for a long moment, then at me, and something in her expression shifted, not into guilt, but into something colder and more calculated, like she was recalculating exactly how much of the truth this situation was now going to require. So you've been spying on me, she said. Having people follow me around. That's what you've been doing instead of just talking to me like an adult. I didn't ask anyone to follow you, I said, my voice cracking despite every effort to keep it level. Sydney came to me. Because she couldn't watch this happen anymore. Derek, Natalie. 5 months, according to what I've pieced together. Explain to me how that's nobody. Maybe I lied because you'd already decided I was guilty of something long before there was anything to be guilty of, she said, and I felt the ground shift under that sentence. The particular vertigo of being told the version of events I'd lived through hadn't actually happened the way I remembered it. You've been suspicious of me for months, checking my phone, asking who I was talking to every time it buzzed. Do you know what that does to a person? Maybe I found something with Derek because you'd already stopped trusting me long before there was any reason to. I want to be honest that this landed somewhere in me, for just a moment, the particular skill of being made to doubt your own memory of events, of being told your reasonable suspicion was the actual cause of the thing it had been responding to. It took me a second to find my footing again. I didn't start noticing things until after you started lying to me, I said. That's not the same thing, and you know it isn't. Believe whatever you need to believe, she said, standing now, moving toward the window. It doesn't change what's already happened. How long, really? 5 months, or longer than that? She was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, something in her posture had changed, not softened, but shifted, like continuing to deny it had stopped feeling worth the energy. 5 months, she said. Since June. It started at one of Courtney's things, some rooftop event I only went to because she practically dragged me there. And I'm not going to sit here and act ashamed of all of it, because I'm not. I felt more like myself these past 5 months than I have in years. I'm not going to apologize for that just because it's inconvenient for you to hear right now. Not going to apologize, I repeated, the word strange in my mouth. You lied to my face for 5 months and you're not going to apologize. What do you want me to say, Jeffrey? That I'm sorry. Fine, I'm sorry you found out. I'm not sorry it happened. I sat there for a moment, absorbing the particular cruelty of that distinction, sorry I got caught, not sorry for what I did, and something in me that had been holding on to some small, foolish hope finally let go entirely. Do you love him? I asked, and I'm still not sure why that was the question that surfaced, out of everything I could have asked. I don't know, she said. I know I don't feel anything close to what I used to feel here, in this apartment, with you. Maybe that's the same thing. Maybe it isn't. So what happens now? I'm not staying here to be interrogated for the next 6 months, she said, already moving toward the bedroom. I'll get my things this week. You can keep the apartment. I don't want it anyway, it doesn't feel like mine anymore. There was no confession offered in the way I'd braced myself for, no tearful accounting of how it started, no explanation delivered in a voice that wanted forgiveness. Just a woman folding clothes into a suitcase with brisk, efficient movements, answering my questions in short sentences, already several steps removed from the 8 years we'd shared. That's it? I said, standing in the doorway of our bedroom, watching her pack like she was preparing for a business trip rather than the end of a marriage. 8 years, and that's it? You deserve better than this conversation dragging on, she said, not quite looking at me. You deserve better than me, honestly, if we're being truthful about it. I don't say that to make myself feel better. I think it's just true. I didn't know it yet, standing there, but that would be the last real conversation Natalie and I would ever have as a married couple, and somewhere underneath the anger, a part of me was already, quietly, starting to feel something closer to relief than I was ready to admit. Natalie moved out 4 days later, taking most of what had always been hers and leaving behind the things that had somehow always felt more like mine, a bookshelf we'd built together our second year, a set of mismatched mugs from a weekend trip we'd taken back when trips together still felt uncomplicated. She didn't ask for counseling. She didn't ask for time to think it over. There was no version of this ending where she came back weeks later wanting to try again, no long process of reconciliation attempted and failed. She was simply gone, in the same efficient, unsentimental way she'd packed that suitcase, and I was left standing in an apartment that suddenly felt much larger than it had a month before. I called Courtney once, weeks later, mostly to understand what I hadn't been able to see clearly at the time. She apologized, finally, for how long she'd stayed quiet. I told her she needed to tell you herself, Courtney said. More than once. I didn't think it was my place to be the one who broke it to you, and I still don't fully know if that was the right call. I'm sorry, Jeffrey. I mean that. I told her I understood, even though understanding it and being okay with it turned out to be two very different things I was still learning to separate. Sydney reached out again too, a short message that said simply, I should have said something sooner. I hope you know it wasn't easy to stay quiet, and it wasn't easy to finally speak up either. I told her I appreciated both, the honesty when it finally came, and the fact that it had cost her something to give it. I never heard directly from Derek, and I never went looking for him. I heard, secondhand, through someone who knew someone at his office, that whatever he and Natalie had together didn't survive the transition from secret to public, that the version of their relationship which had thrived in the shadows of my marriage seemed to lose something essential once it no longer had anything to hide from. I don't know if that's true. I've stopped needing it to be, one way or another. Whatever happens between them isn't mine to track anymore. I called it his mistake and hers both. At first, the fact that I'd spent so many months giving Natalie the benefit of every doubt, hoping she'd tell me the truth voluntarily rather than forcing me to go find it myself. I don't think that excuses what she did, not even slightly. But I've come to understand my own part in it clearly enough now that I don't intend to repeat it, the habit of choosing hope over evidence, of mistaking silence for peace. The apartment on Winslow Street is still mine. I kept it, mostly because moving felt like giving up something that had never actually done anything wrong. Some mornings I still catch myself listening for her key in the door before I remember there's no reason to. That reflex is fading slower than I expected, and faster than I feared it might. If there's a lesson in 8 years ending the way this one did, it isn't really about Natalie, or Derek, or even the 5 months I spent not knowing what I'd already, on some level, suspected. It's about the difference between trusting someone and refusing to look honestly at what's actually in front of you, because looking felt like it might cost you something you weren't ready to lose. I lost it anyway. I just spent more time getting there than I needed to. I don't hate her, not most days. I loved her for 8 years, and I don't think loving someone that long simply disappears because the story ended somewhere ugly. What I've learned to hold on to instead is simpler. I asked the question, eventually. I kept asking until I got an answer that was actually true, even when the truth cost me everything I thought I still had left to lose. And she was right about one thing, even if she said it for the wrong reasons, on her way out the door. I did deserve better. I'm still learning what that actually looks like. The most revealing moment in this story isn't the confrontation itself, but the speed of Natalie's denial the first time Jeffrey said Derek's name out loud, a rehearsed coldness that shows she had been anticipating that exact question for weeks, quietly preparing her defense while Jeffrey was still preparing his hope. What the story ultimately exposes is a familiar and quietly devastating form of manipulation, turning a partner's reasonable suspicion into evidence of his own character flaw, reframing the wound as the wound's cause. Courtney's silence functions as its own smaller betrayal, revealing how loyalty to a friend can curdle into complicity when it prioritizes comfort over honesty. She never lied outright, but her silence did work she wasn't willing to do with words. Unlike stories that end in remorse and reconciliation, this one denies Jeffrey the closure of an apology that means anything, forcing him to build his own peace without her cooperation, a harder, more honest kind of ending than the ones that arrive wrapped in tears. The absence of any real consequence for Derek is deliberate and true to how these situations often actually unfold. Affairs rarely distribute their damage evenly, and the story doesn't pretend otherwise. What remains, in the end, is Jeffrey's slow understanding that trust without honest inquiry isn't really trust at all, it's avoidance wearing trust's clothing, and the real work ahead of him is learning to ask hard questions before the evidence forces his hand for him.